Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Sell More Book Show, episode 555. I'm Bryan Cohen from Best Page Forward, joined by the master of malice himself, David Viergutz. I'm really excited that you're here, sir, because I think it's probably been 450 episodes since we've had a horror author, so it might have been 8 years, and now someone is here, but how are you?
Good, Brian. Thanks for bringing me on. Yeah, I know we exist.
I do. I know that too.
There's proof in that, but how many of us there are is another story.
I know. It's always one of those things where there is there's always an author who is successful within every subgenre. There would not be that subgenre if they didn't have someone or multiple people to look up to. Obviously, in horror, a lot of people in the trad world look up to the Stephen Kings of the world. But what I love about the indie world is that I did not know about your incredible strategies, which were very different than a lot of authors employ. And I know we're going to talk about it a little more later, but who thinks to just mail stuff to people, like in letter form? But you decided, or you came to this idea that, hey, horror is kind of a good genre for sending creepy letters to people. Tell me a little bit more about scare mail.
Yeah, I mean, it's been the hot button topic for folks lately, from a success point of view, also from just doing things a little bit different. People want to know about it, so I get it. It really comes down to is earlier this year I saw that people were buying Taylor Swift tickets.
Yeah.
And you would not believe that my scare mail came from Taylor Swift, but it did. I noticed that people were buying Taylor Swift tickets, and I saw the price on some of these tickets, like near $500. And,
right.
And in combination with that, earlier, somebody had mentioned that we could take a lot away from the singer-songwriter world and how they are doing things and how we as authors can adapt that. We make a product and we hope it sells over and over and over again, and then we have different verticals we can go with. And so with Taylor Swift, she had a ticket for $500, and I was like, well, why not buy the song for $12.99 for the album or whatever, or just listen for free? I mean, it's not very different than what we do, right? I mean, you can go to KU and listen to, or basically purchase the book for free, or you can go and buy the album, support the author or the book directly. You know what I'm saying? You can do the exact same thing as singer-songwriter. So I was like, well, why can't I sell an experience? And so what kind of experience should I sell? And that's where I said, well, I was standing out there and I was looking out the front door of my house, and there's a mailbox, and I was waiting for an Amazon package. And I was looking at my mailbox, and I was like, man, there's nothing good in that mailbox.
Yeah.
It's gonna be junk. It's gonna be garbage. It's gonna be stuff I don't want. And the idea came to me, and I'm not new to this space. I'm not the first one into this space.
Of course,
this has been happening for, decades. Letters in the mail go back decades. Stories in the mail go back even further. But what I saw was an experience, and so I designed an experience around a story. It's still a novel in effect.
Right.
It is a story from beginning to middle to end. It's just told in a different way. Just like you go to a Taylor Swift concert, it is just the same songs. It is just told in a different. It is just performed in a different way.
Yeah.
And so if it wasn't scare mail, it was going to be some other experience, because with an experience, it's easier to stand out from the crowd.
Yeah.
We can get a ton of people to join a Facebook group, but you can only, but it's hard to monetize that versus, hey, here's an in-person show. It's $400 when it's the same thing. It's the same crowd, the same people who would be in that Facebook group, but here's the ticket and it sells out. And so the experience is what I'm capitalizing on from now and, and with scare mail.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting. A few weeks ago, we literally had the question of the week. What is something you took from the way Taylor Swift does things? And so, well, now we have your answer on that question, which is so great. So going from law enforcement all the way to inspired by Taylor Swift to mail stories to people in a new form of serialization, we don't have a ton of time, but in 60 seconds or less, I suppose, what do you think was the the inciting incident for your move to being a horror author?
Yeah, so I mean, 60 seconds or less. I mean, I started writing years ago. I mean, like, and I was a personal trainer and is in law enforcement. I was building a business, and I had wanted to be an author for 20 something years, and I'd always been told it was out of reach. You had to have, luck or sell your soul or something like that to get a traditional deal. And, self-publishing wasn't a thing. And if it was a thing, it was looked down on. And I got hit with a course, and the course seemed like it made it easy. And when that happened, I wrote my first book, and I was like, well, this is a great book and I love it, but it's way too dark for the genre I'm writing in. And my buddy at the time, I had a writing group, and he said, try writing a horror book, and straight horror. And so I wrote a horror book, and he read it, and he said, you're a horror author. Stop writing this other genre. Welcome to your people, basically.
Yeah.
And I stuck to it from there. And I bounced around. I played with some other genres. When you write a lot of books, you get really good at writing books quickly. And so when you write a lot of books quickly, it tends to be easier to explore, even though you might be, moving outside your lane just a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, that's it. That's my story is very similar to everybody else's. I wanted to write a book. It started with one, wrote one for myself, and it became 20 something. And
yeah,
that's about it.
Yeah, they do pile up after a bit.
Yeah, you lose track.
Someone was telling me it's about consistency, community, and courage is kind of the 3 C's of making this career happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so you started with the consistency.
Yeah,
build up your community from there.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of like low points. There are a lot of low points where I was like, I should quit. I should quit. I should write another genre. That's what I mean. But switching genres isn't always the solution. Sometimes it's a pivot.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of people who are in big genres who are doing all the right things are still struggling. The ones that, I mean, there are a ton of authors who are really just trying to, they're doing the right things, the things you would look at from the surface and say, yeah, like your cover's on point, your ads are on point, everything's on point, but for whatever reason, you just don't have traction. And, it's not unreasonable to suggest that, maybe you need to pivot, maybe you need to keep going, but, having that courage and never quitting is obviously, the only way to ensure you're not going to make any money is to quit, right?
Yes. Oh, 100%. 100%. Well, I'm glad you're here today. We'll get into the show proper here.
Sure.
I will have an ad read here. I'm going to let everybody know I've got my Black Friday sale going, including some really cool bundles of coaching and courses and other things. bestpageforward.net/Black Friday, 20 to 40% off all the things. So go check that out, running through the day after Cyber Monday. What is that? Small Business Tuesday? Something like that.
I don't know.
There's a name for everything. Yeah. I don't know. We've got too many things. But we have a question I just put into the show for today because this will air the day before Thanksgiving. So, David, what are you thankful for this year for authors or for your own author career?
Yeah, I mean, largely it's been a really positive vibe from the community as a whole. There's not a whole lot of drama that just kind of overflows on everything. Everybody largely just feels good about being an author, despite, the election and the news or whatever else, just people's lives, they seem overall happier with being an author. The AI scare seems to have died down to where people are no longer afraid that they can't be an author anymore. So that just the overall feeling just seems to it's a good time to be an author.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And to piggyback on your point of life is just better as an author. I mean, so many people never get to tell their stories either through fear or just through circumstance. And everyone listening to this show, folks who might catch this in the future, you're either telling your stories actively or you have been getting ready to tell your story. And that's a really good place to be in creatively. I'm glad we're here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I saw it in real time. I mean, my wife came with me for the first time to Author Nation.
Oh, nice.
And she was so inspired by the energy there that she even started writing her first book.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, you would never think. She's been an avid reader for forever. And she's always watched me and never really understood the community and the vibe and what it's like. And then sat down one day and was like, I've got 3 books outlined. Like, I got to get started. Yeah. So it's a great time.
You can do a spinoff, Spouse Mail.
Yeah. That's spouse mail. Yeah. Right.
Awesome. Well, let's get into the top story for this week, which is Indies on the Rise. Quote, in both 2022 and 2023, self-published titles outpaced traditionally published books by more than 2 million titles, an eye-opening margin, says Andrew Albanese and Jim Milliot of Publishers Weekly. The rise in self-published books is thought to be a combination of better education in the author community, a greater acceptance of self-publishing by both readers and authors, and increasingly easier to use tools and services that allow authors to publish cost-effectively. Kris Austin, CEO of Draft2Digital, says, quote, the ecosystem includes service providers, clubs, forums, indie author magazines, and dedicated indie author conferences. It is no longer just about how to self-publish a book. It's matured into how to grow and sustain a successful publishing business, end quote. Written Word Media's 2024 Indie Author Survey showed that many self-published authors are able to make a full-time living from their books. Quote, another sign of financial success for indies in the growing number of traditional publishers signing major deals for previously self-published books and series, says Publishers Weekly. Meanwhile, Jane Friedman in her Hotsheet Newsletter says, while the number of self-published titles with ISBNs went up by 7.2% 2023 over 2022, the number of traditionally published books fell by 3.6% in the same time period. So, David, Roland, who gathers these stories, made sure to point out this was before AI had really spread, so this isn't because of people publishing titles maybe more quickly in the last year. This is prior to that data. We are seeing a lot more self-published authors than we're seeing the traditionally published authors. What stuck out to you in this?
I mean, it's I think it's largely kind of inherent, right? I mean, traditional publishers, these large corporations, there's 4 of them now, and
right.
we as independents can move very quickly into the market and very quickly wrap ourselves around our communities as these kind of micro influencers. I mean, it's if people already have a built-in audience and then they publish something that can now be purchased, I mean, the likelihood of that being bought up very quickly is already there. We can build communities, we can pivot in the market, we can produce a whole lot faster than traditional publishers can. I mean, there is a bottleneck that comes into these publishing companies that we don't have. If we need an editor, we can go find another editor real quick, versus the publishing companies, which may only have a certain amount on staff and a schedule that's 2, 3, 4 years out.
Yeah.
So I think it largely just becomes, part of it's kind of unmeasurable, right? It's that portion that says, hey, look, it's become easy to become an indie now, right? Instead of waiting for that traditional deal, we can immediately move into selling and immediately move into producing more and to building out our companies, a little bit at a time. And then it's also easy to stay flexible within that industry as well, to be able to be agile and say, hey, look, if there's a market trend that we need to adapt to, we can do so very quickly.
Yeah.
Versus traditional publishing, which is kind of a bit of a dinosaur. They're getting better, but they're a little bit of a dinosaur in the industry, kind of stuck on some old ways that haven't really made it there. I'm starting to see some more traditional titles, being pushed on TikTok and Instagram,
right?
Beyond the book brush mock-up, like people actually out there as influencers who are paid or whatever to produce content for these traditionally published books. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think it's a, the independent has always moved a little bit quicker than the corporation, I think, bringing a product to market.
Right. I mean, I find it really interesting. It is not a surprise to me that traditionally, self-published books went up by numbers. It was a surprise to me a little bit that traditional books went down. And you brought up a really good point with the consolidation of now only 4 big traditional publishing companies. But I mean, is it what I'm trying to figure, and we can only speculate on this really. Sure. What I'm trying to figure is it leakage of traditional publishers, published authors coming over to the indie world? Is it just that these companies are not making as much money, so they literally can't publish as many books as they used to? It's just interesting to me that number specifically, the number of ISBN trad pub books went down. What do you think could be the main cause?
Well, and so there's an example I think about, and that's Brandon Sanderson, for example.
Yes.
Sanderson showed us that traditional published authors can make a splash in the market with something different that is other than a traditional ISBN book. I mean, all those that he published, or the majority of them, were independently published, essentially under his company, rather than going through his traditional deal and distributors. I mean, it was something that I think they even told him, like, go ahead, like, totally fine.
Yeah.
We have no problem with you doing it. And then they're probably checking the fine script later, the fine print later, to find out there's a piece of that puzzle that they might be able to take up for themselves. But it's also probably because I think it was a report, and you would probably be better off to find it, but it was a report a few years back about how many titles traditionally published are purchasing up. These trad publishers are purchasing up versus how much they're actually making.
Yeah.
And so, is it possible that there's a downturn in how many they're picking up to go after the ones that they know will do better, or that they have a long history of doing better? So they're publishing less titles, but essentially the ones that are guaranteed to make a little bit more money, versus just kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. I mean, that was largely that report. I think it's got to be 2-3 years ago from that report, but it was like something like 15,000 titles, and like none of them earned out except for like the 1% on their advances or something like that. I could be totally wrong on the numbers, but it was a large proportion of them. I mean, that's all I really could see it. I'm not too tapped into the traditional markets. I can only speculate from the outside and kind of from a business perspective. Like, I know the margins are already slim on ebooks, and I can't imagine, how slim they are when you get, a giant corporation involved and everybody's getting a little piece of that $8.99 ebook. I can't imagine there's much left over at the end. So it's got to be from auxiliary stuff in the end anyways.
Right.
I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I think that kind of my big takeaway overall is that we, as an industry, it's growing. It's continuing to grow. As you mentioned up top, it does get harder over time because there are more titles out there. But it's good to know that we're maturing as an industry. It's good to know that we haven't leveled off, that there is more opportunity to grow, better tools, better conferences, as was mentioned. I mean, I remember the early days, the first 20 Books Vegas, one of the early conferences, the Self-Publishing Podcasts Conference back 2016 or so in Austin, Texas. There were not as many people coming to these things because it just hadn't gotten to that point as an industry. And even if there might be fewer people that went to Author Nation than 20 Books Vegas, the final 20 Books Vegas, it was still 1,000 people. And that just goes to show there's more money coming in, there's more people working in it. And so I think it's definitely just possible that some of the resources from the traditional publishing world shifted. And as a result, that led to fewer titles being published.
Yeah. I mean, and the industry as a self-publisher 10 years ago was probably a whole lot more difficult than it was nowadays. I mean, you could talk about the gold rush of indie publishing. If you remember anything about history and gold rush, it was also not an easy time to live, right? I mean, so the same idea, you could win big or you could lose big, essentially. And that's what, that was a large portion of that time period was spent learning this new industry and the way things are done and pioneering new things and things moving forward. And so, I mean, it's gotten easier. But also the market's gotten bigger. But I mean, there's a bit of positivity in this too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, we will never produce enough books for readers to consume or as fast as they consume them. There's no way. even with AI, there's too many people who are reading and reading a lot, and then pulling out the things that they want too. It's not just here's a book, read it. It is finding the books that they want to read and will read very quickly. And so that's there's a lot of hope in that too.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Well, let's move on to the lightning round, where
Sure.
we try to answer 60 seconds or less, but it doesn't always go that way. We like to start things off, David, with a lightning sound or thunder sound. As a horror author,
Yeah.
I'm sure you hear these every time you're writing. So
Yeah.
have at it, sir.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate you. I mean, that's all I can think of. It's got to be like a snap, I guess.
Yeah.
A crackle.
I thought that was good. I thought that was good.
I'm not going to quit my career for it, but I mean,
hey, well, it's okay to be a multi-hyphenate. So, David, I'm going to pivot on this question a little bit because we already kind of answered it. So, in a way, scare mail, where you mail your stories in the form of letters to the subscription readers, it's kind of an old concept in a way, but not so tested here in 2024. What was your kind of proof of concept of this, that it would work? Because people are scared to be the trailblazer of things. So how did you go about it?
I mean, the less interesting answer is I sold it to my list first. I mean, that's the least interesting version of it. Was I tested it on, I had a mailing list of like 30,000, and I sold like 200 or 300 copies. And I was like, okay, like that's a pretty decent conversion to, especially for the price point. So I was like, there's my proof of concept. I pre-sold it to a bunch of people, and they were like, yes, I want this. The more interesting version of it, it was like, it with the age of AI, and I know I don't know, it's probably not meant to be an AI conversation, but just talking about it just briefly, AI leveled the playing field for everyone. So now content is being produced very quickly. Now, what will rise to the top is going to be the good content, and then the people who can then advocate for that good content. And so, in the end, my plan is never been to be just write the greatest book ever. It is to become the greatest book writer to the people that I can meet. And so if I can bring people into my fold, I can write whatever I want because I've brought them onto me. And so Scare Mail was essentially that. I said, I want to get closer to readers. I want to get closer to fans. And so, letters are very personal. I send a lot of physical products in the mail to my readers. Even before Scare Mail, I was direct. Before then, I was doing 5, 6, 7,000 a month in book sales, in physical book sales to my readers. And so I do like putting my hands on signed copies and sending them. I sign all kinds of stuff, and my brand's all over it. It's a lot of fun to package up orders and to wrap them together. And so enforcing that community behind me, becoming that person that readers can go to. That's what I'm looking for. It wasn't just produce a lot of books quickly. It was to create a community around me. And so I doubled down on that with Scare Mail. That's
awesome. I love that. I believe you have a question for me in here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit. Like, so, this is an old concept. I'm not I am somewhat of a pioneer to it, maybe for horror, but it's an old concept. What are your thoughts on, old concepts that could be, potentially coming back in the digital age? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I think it's really interesting that you brought up how the playing field has become level on the digital playing field. There's lots of digital ways to get in touch with people, but one of the things I found over the last couple of years, especially after the pandemic, was people craved community. People craved other people, and that isn't always in the form of in person. It can be in the form of virtual. It can be in the form of just chatting somebody up, sliding into their DMs. And I think this is something I've learned a lot of lately. I have a coach who has encouraged me, don't just send emails, don't just post on social media, start conversations with people, actually talk to people. And my first reaction, as many people in the entrepreneurial spaces, but that's not scalable.
Right.
And it's not. And I think kind of, in a way, the old concept that's very, very general that I think needs to be brought back is, if you have not been able to get a foothold doing scalable things like
Right.
releasing books rapidly and uh, doing all these promos and running ads, these things that are scalable, if they're not working for you,
Right.
then it is okay to step back and try to do non-scalable things like talking to people, like shipping things and signing them, like making bespoke versions of your book. These are not scalable. And I don't think they should take up all your time, because it's okay to have a balance. But if you're not getting the scalable things to work for you, figure out a non-scalable thing that you enjoy doing that you can focus on getting better at.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, one of the things I did, I had this idea for this service for authors,
Mm.
and a buddy of mine looked at me and he said, what do you think you would get from your readership if you invested the time that you were going to spend building the service? What would you think, how would your readership respond? I was like, I don't know. And he's like, why don't you try it? And so I was like, okay. So I did the most personal thing I could. And, I'm direct. People are used to seeing my stuff, and I'm used to having their email address and phone numbers and everything like that. I text my people. I send them emails. I started calling them just randomly. I'll pick someone from my list. I've got, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 people, customers. And I just pick one. And I call them, and I just tell them thanks. I spend 2 minutes, and if they don't answer, I find somebody else, or I leave a voice message and say, hey, this is author David Viergutz. I just want to call and say thanks. That's it. And I saw the interactions in my Facebook group just explode. People were just like, oh my gosh, like, he called, like, this is crazy. And so, yeah, it's to a point. It's not a scalable thing. I can't, unless I go with robocalls, but nobody wants that, so it's not a scalable thing. But the returns, I mean, not only does it feel good for somebody else, but you can see it, where, especially if you think about this, those customers are going to spend a certain amount of money over time.
Right.
And if you can hold on to them, and you can continually prove that you're worthy of their money, because that's what we have to kind of do, is prove that we're worthy, because there are plenty of other people they can purchase from. My average order value from my main customers is anywhere between $400 to $700 they've spent on me over the years. And so that's powerful. That's powerful. And so, yeah, it's not scalable, but the returns are definitely there, I think.
I love that. I love that you called them. I mean, how many authors would think to do that? But it's possible.
Sure.
It's always possible. Kind of pivoting to the horror genre in general, like we've talked about, it can be harder in some genres. I can point to a lot more successful contemporary romance authors than I can horror authors. How do you feel like the horror genre has changed? Are the same things you worked on in 2017 still selling in 2024? I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, I think horror it's a really cool genre, because it's one that, when people say horror, they say Stephen King, right? And that's largely, or they think Scream and Saw and everything else disgusting. It kind of gets all lumped together. And what's happened in the last probably 2-3 years is that horror is largely dividing out into these well-established subgenres of horror. There are independent awards, huge awards for splatterpunk, which is as over the top as you can get, right? It's that extreme horror, and there is a place for that. We're not, and I don't knock any genre of writing in general. I think all writing is good writing. There should be more authors out there, and so these splatterpunk awards, that's a big deal. And then we're seeing this other type of horror that's coming about that's called, like, they're calling it cozy horror. So it's a step, not quite a thriller, but also kind of still within the spooky vein. Kind of think like Goosebumps for adults, right? So this is like your Darcy Coates. She's becoming this name that's really big and trad. She's got a lot of books out there. The covers are great, and it's your average stuff, haunting this, terrifying that, but it's not quite the level of what I call mainstream, right down the middle, kind of for everybody type horror. And so we're seeing this division, right, between these subgenres. And so as these subgenres kind of grow, people have there are expectations within those. Those are those tropes that we talked about. And so I stay right in the middle of the lane. I want to be as close to find as many readers as I can. And so I don't go to the cozy side and I don't go to the extreme side. And so some of the tropes that we're seeing a lot of that people are kind of okay with seeing again are kind of the creature features, right? People they want to know about mysteries and monsters and cryptids and weird things that weren't ever there before. I mean, think about the Alien franchise, right?
Right.
Aliens are not a new concept, but an alien with acid blood that grows in your chest was a new concept. And so they're like, I mean, and look how well it does.
Right.
Creature features are very good, psychological too, especially with this big focus on mental health lately in the last few years, post COVID. These psychological type horror where maybe the terror is in somebody's mind. That's another trope that people are just kind of like, they're getting to be okay with more often rather than being upset and surprised by it. Like, oh no, it was all in my head.
Yeah.
And then, and I think probably the other one too is just the final girl, right? People like an underdog story. People like when there is a hero. And so the final girl or final guy allows for that hero to be there, even though in horror, it's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be, you can only survive the evil thing. You cannot defeat it. But the final girl or the final boy or whatever gives you that. It gives you that survivor and it gives you that person that can defeat the evil. And so that's a great feeling too. So so I think that's about it. I mean, that's all I really can think about of lately. And those are I mean, there's plenty more, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But those are the veins that I stay in, But, there's a lot to learn. Yeah. There's a lot to learn in any genre. Romance has just exploded. There's so much now. I can't even keep track of it, but it's also this massive genre, and if you're diving into a new genre, you've got to learn these things, right? Now I did that. I started learning about FBI crime thrillers because I was like, this is kind of a cool genre. And so I learned all about it and I read a ton of those books in order to learn those tropes. But, as authors, we know this takes a ton of time. Yeah. And so what are your thoughts on how we can dedicate the time needed if we want to go learn new tropes to read these books, to learn from the people who have done well, but still set some time aside for ourselves? Like, how do we get there?
I think some people are not going to like my answer, which I'm excited about.
Yeah.
Because I like rubbing people the wrong way and making them think. But so many people are excited, and I know the high learners and the high intellection type people for Clifton Strengths, they think, well, I got to take another course on marketing. I got to do this. I got to do that. And I've got to write. So how am I supposed to read? And the answer is do less on the marketing learning side. Learn less marketing. Because when you write a book that has an opportunity to sell, it will sell itself to a certain extent. You'll be able to see that it's selling on its own. Because if you have to fight and claw to sell one copy, it might not be the book. It might not be the series yet. But if you strip away and say, I'm going to do less marketing learning, and I am going to do more reading, that is a good trade to make at the early stage of the game, and it still counts as the early stage of the game if you have not yet gotten anywhere close to your goals. Then it still counts as the early stage of the game where you can say, I am going to take my marketing time per week down from 5 hours to 1 and my reading time from 0 to 4. I think it's going to be a good trade for most people.
Yeah, I mean, and reading is a form of studying, right? We learn from the people who've been there before to understand what the expectation is for the reader. Now, we can subvert that to a point, but it's going to be really hard to write a thriller when you're trying to jump into thriller genre when you haven't read a thriller before.
Right. Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So last question of the lightning round. David, you're a podcaster too with your Nightmare Engine podcast. Do you feel like you reach more readers or authors with this kind of a show?
Yeah, so we're reader facing. So
Yeah.
even on my welcome sequence for people, new customers, I tell them about the podcast because it introduces them to horror authors that I've
Mm,
interviewed. And it's not a marketing primarily show. We talk about
yeah.
anything but marketing, essentially, from anything within the horror community, because people in the horror community have largely been underserved, and I think that's probably why there's a lot of success. Why I have a lot of success with this stuff is because it's largely underserved, and if you can provide them something outside of Halloween, they'll jump on it, right? Because they like this stuff. I mean, so you know, so I tend to bring on horror authors that have a following themselves, and so then they can then showcase themselves and say, "Hey, look, I've got something more for my readers too, so you can learn more about me." And it's humanizing the author, and it's also talking about the fun stuff that makes us relatable. So we talk
Yeah.
about the movies, we talk about comics and stories, and we dabble in inspiration, but we really don't talk about what's your writing routine or how many
Right.
words a day do what's your office setup and what apps do you use, and tell me about Facebook ads. Readers don't care about that.
No, they do
um
not.
so it's reader facing for sure.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, we've come to the end of the show, the last section. We need to come up with a question of the week here, David. Obviously, we talked about this indies versus trad pub books, sort of interesting, but I feel like we've covered some other interesting ground. What do you think would be a good direction and or a question? I'm happy to just come up with a question based on your direction here, but what question would you like to ask the listeners for today?
Yeah, so I guess moving forward, we know Facebook ads, we know social media, we know all these things, but what other things could we be doing that create a more immersive experience for our readers that make us stand out from the crowd? So
Mm,
if everybody is just running Facebook ads, what can you do to get a leg up on those folks? What else can you do? It may not be an email, it may not be a letter in the mail, but maybe it's that phone call. What
mm,
else could you do that's a little bit different than everybody else that people say, this is my guy?
I love it. Great question. You guys can answer it over at the Sell More Book Show After Party Facebook group or over on sellmorebookshow.com. David, it was great having you here. We're going to do a second episode that we'll record in 2 seconds, but y'all here in a week. So, David, where can people find more from the master of malice himself?
Yeah. It's really easy. Just davidviergutz.com. That's the only place. That's the official location. My podcast is there. My books are there. Everything's in one spot.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you for coming here today. I really appreciate having you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Of course. Folks, you can catch more of David next week. I'm Brian. Come back. We'll be here for episode 556. Have a great week of book selling, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Thank you all.